The morning mist clung to the waters of the Aegean Sea like a shroud, but beneath its cover, something extraordinary was stirring. 16,000 young men from the far corners of the earth were about to write their names in blood across a narrow strip of Turkish coastline. They had no idea that in just a few hours, half of them would be dead or wounded. They had no idea that their sacrifice would birth a legend that would echo through generations. This is the story of April 25th, 1915. The day ordinary farmers, clerks and laborers from Australia and New Zealand became immortal. What happened at Gallipoli was supposed to be a masterstroke, a brilliant flanking maneuver that would knock the Ottoman Empire out of the Great War and open the gates to victory. Instead, it became one of the most catastrophic military disasters in modern history. Yet from the ashes of that failure emerged something far more powerful than any tactical success could have achieved: the birth of a national spirit, the forging of the Anzac legend. But legends are born in moments of truth. And truth, as those 16,000 men were about to discover, is written in steel and fire on beaches where the sea runs red with the blood of heroes. The year 1914 had shattered the old world like glass. Europe, once the pinnacle of civilization, had descended into a mechanized hell of trenches, gas and machine guns. The Western Front had become a graveyard where nations fed their youth into the hungry maw of industrial warfare. Millions of men sat in muddy holes, staring across no man's land at other men in muddy holes, neither side able to break the deadly stalemate. But there was another front, another gamble, another chance to end the war before it consumed an entire generation: the Dardanelles, a 38-mile channel of water separating Europe from Asia, controlled by the crumbling Ottoman Empire. If the Allies could force this narrow strait, they could capture Constantinople, knock Turkey out of the war, and open a sea route to their struggling Russian allies. It was audacious, it was brilliant, and it would require an amphibious assault on a scale never before attempted. The Mediterranean expeditionary force assembled for this monumental task was a testament to the global reach of the British Empire. 70,000 men drawn from across the earth, seasoned British regulars who had fought in the mud of France, French colonial troops hardened by desert campaigns, Indian soldiers who had marched across the burning plains of the subcontinent, Newfoundlanders who had crossed an ocean to serve their king, and from the bottom of the world, 16,000 volunteers who had never seen a real war. Australians and New Zealanders formed into the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the ANZACs. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers' sons from the wheat fields of Victoria, stockmen from the cattle stations of Queensland, shop clerks from the streets of Sydney, miners from the goldfields of Western Australia, young men who had answered their empire's call with enthusiasm that bordered on innocence. They had trained in the scorching heat of Egypt, learned to march in formation, learned to handle their rifles, learned to take orders, but nothing could have prepared them for what awaited them on the shores of Gallipoli. The plan seemed straightforward enough on paper. The British 29th Division would storm ashore at Cape Helles, the southern tip of the peninsula, and drive north to capture the heights of Achi. Meanwhile, the ANZACs would land further north at a place called Gaba Tepe, seize the commanding ridges of the Sari Bair range, and advance on Tepe, which controlled the vital roadways of the peninsula. It was a classic pincer movement, designed to crush the Turkish defenders between two advancing armies. The Turks, they believed, would crumble under the assault. After all, the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe, its armies demoralized by recent defeats in the Balkans. Surely these colonial troops, led by experienced British officers, would sweep aside any resistance and be dining in Constantinople within the week. They were catastrophically wrong. What the Allied planners failed to understand was that they faced not the decaying remnant of a medieval empire, but a nation reborn in the crucible of war. The Ottoman Empire had indeed suffered defeats, but those defeats had forged a new generation of leaders. Men like Enver Pasha, who had modernized the Turkish military with German help. Men like Mustafa Kemal, a brilliant young officer who understood that the key to victory lay not in grand gestures, but in holding every inch of ground with fanatical determination. The Turkish defenders knew their land. They had studied every beach, every ridge, every ravine. They had built trenches and strongpoints with interlocking fields of fire. They had positioned their artillery to turn any landing into a killing ground. And they had something the Allies underestimated: the fierce pride of men fighting for their homeland. As March turned to April in 1915, the signs of impending assault became impossible to ignore. British and French warships gathered in the harbors of the Greek islands. Transports loaded with men and supplies moved through the Aegean like a vast armada. Reconnaissance flights revealed the build-up to Turkish commanders, who quietly moved their best troops into position. The original assault date of April 23rd was postponed due to rough seas, adding to the tension that gripped both sides. In the Turkish trenches overlooking the beaches, soldiers checked their weapons and whispered prayers. In the holds of the transport ships, young Australians and New Zealanders wrote letters home, cleaned their rifles, and tried to ignore the churning in their stomachs that had nothing to do with seasickness. They were about to collide with history, and history, as they would soon learn, shows no mercy to the unprepared. Lieutenant Colonel Şefik Aker of the Turkish 27th Regiment stood on the headland at Ari Burnu at 2 in the morning on April 25th, scanning the dark waters through his binoculars. The moon cast a silver path across the sea, and in that pale light, he could make out shapes, many shapes. Ships, more ships than he could count, moving like ghosts toward the Turkish coast. His telephone call to Major Ismet was brief and urgent. The enemy was coming. After months of preparation, after weeks of waiting, the moment of truth had arrived. But the Turks were not the only ones peering into the darkness. Aboard HMS Ribble and the other destroyers of the Allied fleet, 16,000 ANZACs prepared for the most important morning of their lives. They blackened their faces with burnt cork. They fixed bayonets to rifles they had never fired in anger. They checked and rechecked their equipment with the nervous energy of men who knew that dawn would bring either glory or death. The covering force, the first wave of the assault, consisted of the finest soldiers the Anzac Corps could provide. The 3rd Australian Brigade had been chosen for the honour of leading the charge. Men of the 9th Battalion from Queensland, the 10th from South Australia, the 11th from Western Australia. These were volunteers who had left behind families, careers, and comfortable lives to serve an empire that many of them had never seen. They had trained for this moment, but training is one thing, reality is another entirely. As the first grey light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, the ships moved closer to shore. The men could smell the land now, could make out the dark bulk of the ridges rising from the water's edge. Somewhere up there, in trenches they could not see, Turkish soldiers waited with loaded rifles and hand grenades. The moment was almost upon them. In minutes, these young men would leap from their boats into the surf and charge up beaches that would soon be littered with the dead and dying. They would discover that war is not the glorious adventure depicted in the recruiting posters. They would learn that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to advance despite it. They were about to become legends. But first, they had to survive the next 24 hours. The boats hit the water with a splash that seemed to echo across eternity. 16,000 hearts hammered against 16,000 chests as the covering force prepared to write the opening chapter of what would become the most sacred story in Australian and New Zealand military history. But something was already going wrong. The landing craft, loaded with men whose faces were blackened with cork and whose hands gripped rifles with white knuckles, were drifting north of their intended target. In the darkness, with currents stronger than anticipated and navigation more treacherous than planned, the precise military operation was already becoming a desperate improvisation. Instead of landing at the relatively gentle slopes of Gaba Tepe, the ANZACs were heading straight for a coastline that would soon earn a name that would haunt military historians for generations. Anzac Cove. The first boats scraped against the shingle at 4:30 in the morning. Before the men could even process what they were seeing, the night exploded into violence. Turkish rifles cracked from the ridges above, their muzzle flashes like deadly fireflies in the pre-dawn darkness. Machine gun fire swept across the water, kicking up fountains of spray that mixed seawater with blood. The men of the 9th, 10th and 11th Battalions leaped into water that was sometimes knee-deep, sometimes chest-deep, stumbling forward under loads that would have challenged pack horses. Their equipment was soaked within seconds. Their careful formations dissolved into chaos as men struggled to find footing on rocks slick with seaweed and spray. But they kept moving forward, because that's what they had been trained to do, because that's what their mates expected of them, because stopping meant dying in the surf like a stranded fish. The beach they found themselves on was nothing like the maps had promised. Instead of open ground suitable for rapid advance, they faced terrain that seemed designed by the devil himself to favor the defender. Steep gullies cut through scrubland so thick that a man could disappear within yards of his comrades. Razor-sharp ridges rose at angles that would challenge a mountain goat. And from every vantage point, Turkish rifles spoke with deadly precision. Within minutes of the first landing, the careful military plan had disintegrated into something far more primal. Small groups of Australians and New Zealanders, separated by the terrain and the chaos of combat, began to move inland, not according to any grand strategy, but simply because moving forward was better than dying on the beach. These were men who had never heard a shot fired in anger before this morning, farmers who had spent their lives coaxing crops from reluctant soil, clerks who had measured their days in ledger entries and filing cabinets, young men whose greatest adventure before this moment had been a Saturday night in town. Now they found themselves scrambling up ravines under fire, their world reduced to the next boulder, the next fold in the ground, the next heartbeat. The Turkish response was swift and devastating. Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, commanding the 19th Division, understood immediately what was at stake. This was not a raid or a reconnaissance in force. This was an invasion that threatened to split his defenses and open the road to Constantinople. His orders to his men would become legend. "I don't order you to fight, I order you to die." But dying, as both sides would soon discover, was easier said than done. The ANZACs, despite their lack of experience, possessed something that could not be taught in any military academy. They had the stubborn courage of men who had chosen to be there. They had the fierce loyalty that comes from standing beside your mates when the world is trying to kill you. And they had a kind of desperate resourcefulness that would turn disaster into determination. As the sun climbed higher, painting the Mediterranean in shades of gold and crimson, the scale of the catastrophe became clear. The ANZACs were not advancing according to plan. They were not seizing the commanding heights of Sari Bair. They were not opening the road to Constantinople. Instead, they were clinging to a narrow strip of coastline, pressed between the sea and an enemy that seemed to multiply with every passing hour. By noon, 2,000 of them were dead or wounded. 2,000 young men who had woken that morning full of hope and determination were now scattered across the gullies and ridges of a peninsula most of them couldn't even pronounce. The medical stations on the beach overflowed with casualties. The water ran red where the wounded were carried down to waiting hospital ships. Any reasonable military commander would have ordered a withdrawal. The assault had failed. The surprise was lost. The casualties were mounting by the hour. Common sense dictated cutting losses and trying again elsewhere. But General Sir Ian Hamilton, watching the carnage from his headquarters ship, made a decision that would echo through history. The ANZACs would stay. They would dig in. They would hold their ground until reinforcements could be landed or evacuation became the only option. What Hamilton couldn't have known was that his decision would transform a military failure into something far more precious. In the desperate hours that followed, as Australian and New Zealand soldiers scraped shallow trenches from the rocky soil and prepared to face the Turkish counterattack, they were creating something that would outlast empires and outlive generations. They were creating the Anzac spirit. The men who had landed as individuals that morning were already becoming something else. The Queensland farmer found himself sharing his water with a New Zealand shepherd. The South Australian clerk handed ammunition to a Western Australian miner he had never met but would now trust with his life. Regional rivalries and colonial differences meant nothing when Turkish or nations. Charles Bullets made no distinction between states. Bean, the Australian war correspondent who had landed with the troops, moved through the chaos with a notebook and a determination to record what he was witnessing. Even in the midst of the carnage, he recognized that something extraordinary was happening. These were not professional soldiers following orders with mechanical precision. These were citizen soldiers improvising, adapting, and enduring with a kind of gallows humor that would become their trademark. As darkness fell on April 25th, the ANZACs controlled perhaps half a square mile of Turkish territory. It was a precarious foothold, overlooked by enemy positions and supplied only by boats that had to brave constant sniper fire. Military strategists would call it a failure, but something else was being born in those hastily dug trenches, something that would prove far more enduring than any tactical victory. The men settling in for their first night on Gallipoli had no idea they were about to become legends. They only knew that they had survived one of the longest days in military history, that their mates were counting on them, and that tomorrow would bring fresh challenges that would test everything they thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and what it meant to be Australian or New Zealand. The beach massacre was over. The legend was just beginning. The sun that rose on April 26th brought no relief to the men clinging to their narrow foothold on the Gallipoli Peninsula. If anything, daylight revealed the full horror of their situation. The Turkish positions commanded every approach. Snipers picked off anyone foolish enough to show themselves above the hastily constructed parapets. Artillery shells screamed down from the heights, turning the beach into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. But the ANZACs adapted with a speed that amazed even their enemies. Men who had never built anything more complex than a fence post became expert engineers overnight. They carved dugouts into the cliff face with bayonets and mess tins. They constructed communication trenches that zigzagged through the scrub like deadly mazes. They learned to move like ghosts, using every fold in the ground, every shadow, every trick that might keep them alive for another hour. The transformation was remarkable. Soldiers who had complained about army food now fought over scraps of bully beef crawling with flies. Men who had grumbled about uncomfortable barracks now slept standing up in trenches barely 3 feet deep. The comfortable assumptions of peacetime life evaporated like morning mist under the harsh sun of war. Water became more precious than gold. Every drop had to be carried up from the beach under sniper fire. Men learned to ration their canteens like misers, taking tiny sips that barely wet their lips. The lucky ones collected rainwater in ground sheets during the brief storms that swept across the peninsula. Others learned to drink their own urine when desperation overcame disgust. Food was equally scarce and infinitely more revolting. Biscuits arrived so hard they could stop bullets, soaked in seawater and often green with mold. Tinned meat that might have been beef or might have been something else entirely attracted. Clouds of flies the moment a can was opened. Fresh vegetables were a distant memory. Scurvy began to appear among the men, their gums bleeding and their teeth loosening in mouths that tasted of metal and despair. Yet, somehow, impossibly, morale held. The ANZACs developed a gallows humor that became their signature. They gave nicknames to Turkish snipers who had become familiar adversaries. They organized betting pools on which trench would be shelled next. They wrote letters home that downplayed the horror and emphasized the adventure, protecting families thousands of miles away from the truth of what their sons and husbands were enduring. The Turks, watching from their superior positions, began to develop a grudging respect for these colonial soldiers who refused to break. Mustafa Kemal himself noted in his dispatches that the Anzac troops displayed a tenacity that surprised even veteran Ottoman officers. These were not the soft colonials they had expected to sweep back into the sea. These were fighters who seemed to grow more determined with every reverse. As April turned to May, the character of the campaign began to change. The war of movement that both sides had anticipated devolved into something grimmer and more familiar. Trench warfare, that hallmark of the Western Front, took root in the gullies and ridges of Gallipoli. But here, compressed into a space smaller than many city neighborhoods, the fighting took on an intimacy that made the battles in France seem almost impersonal by comparison. Men fought with bombs made from jam tins packed with nails and explosives. They hurled these crude grenades back and forth across trenches, so narrow that enemies could hear each other breathing. Sometimes the same bomb would be thrown back and forth 3 or 4 times before exploding. A deadly game of catch that epitomized the surreal nature of the campaign. Bayonet charges became commonplace, not because commanders ordered them, but because there was often no other choice. When Turkish soldiers broke into Anzac trenches, the fighting became hand-to-hand, brutal and primitive. Men who had never harmed another human being learned to kill with knives, clubs, and bare hands. The veneer of civilization stripped away to reveal something far older and more savage. The medical situation grew increasingly desperate as the weeks passed. Wounded men had to be evacuated down narrow paths under constant fire. Stretcher bearers became some of the most heroic figures of the campaign, carrying injured comrades through gullies swept by machine gun fire. Many never made it to the beach. Their bodies joined the thousands already scattered across the peninsula, slowly decomposing under the Mediterranean Sunday. Disease proved as deadly as Turkish bullets. Dysentery swept through the Allied positions with devastating effect. Men weakened by poor food and constant stress succumbed to illnesses that would have been minor inconveniences in peacetime. Enteric fever, typhoid, and a dozen other ailments turned strong young soldiers into hollow-eyed wraiths who could barely hold their rifles. The flies became a torment beyond description. Bloated corpses scattered across no man's land attracted clouds of insects that made eating a nightmare. Men learned to bolt their food while waving their hands constantly to keep the black swarms away from their mouths. Sleep became almost impossible as the buzzing filled every moment of quiet. Yet through it all, the bonds between the men grew stronger. Mateship, that peculiarly Australian concept of loyalty between equals, took on new meaning in the trenches of Gallipoli. Men shared their last cigarettes with strangers. They gave up their blankets to wounded comrades. They wrote letters for illiterate soldiers and carried messages for the dying. The British officers who had initially looked down on these colonial volunteers began to revise their opinions. The ANZACs might lack formal military training, but they possessed something more valuable: the ability to endure without losing their humanity. They could joke in the face of death, show kindness to enemies, and maintain their dignity even when reduced to living like animals. Stories began to emerge that would become part of the legend. An Australian sniper who left chocolate for his Turkish counterpart. New Zealand soldiers who shared their water with wounded Ottoman troops. Men who risked their lives to retrieve the bodies of fallen enemies, treating them with the same respect they showed their own dead. The Turkish defenders, despite their tactical advantages, were paying their own terrible price. Mustafa Kemal's division suffered casualties that would have broken lesser units. His famous order to die rather than retreat was being fulfilled with a literalness that shocked even him. Young Turkish soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens, held positions until the last man fell, but something else was happening in those Turkish trenches. The men defending Gallipoli were also being transformed by the experience. They were discovering their own capacity for heroism, their own reserves of courage they had never known existed. The Ottoman Empire might be dying, but its soldiers were proving that reports of Turkish military decline had been greatly exaggerated. By June, the campaign had settled into a routine of raids, counter-raids, and grinding attrition. Both sides launched attacks that gained a few yards at the cost of hundreds of lives. The maps in headquarters showed minor adjustments to the front lines, but the reality was far grimmer. Every advance was measured in bodies. Every tactical success came at a price that made victory indistinguishable from defeat. The ANZACs learned to live with death as a constant companion. Men developed the ability to sleep next to corpses, to eat while artillery shells exploded nearby, to write cheerful letters home while their friends bled out in the mud beside them. It was a kind of psychological adaptation that would mark them for the rest of their lives. The summer heat intensified the misery beyond imagination. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees in trenches that offered no shade and little ventilation. Water became so scarce that men fought over the privilege of licking condensation from metal surfaces. Uniforms rotted off bodies weakened by malnutrition and disease. Yet still they held. Week after week, month after month, the ANZACs clung to their precarious foothold on the peninsula. They repelled Turkish attacks with a ferocity that surprised their enemies. They launched their own assaults with a courage that impressed even the most cynical British generals. They endured conditions that would have broken professional armies with a stoicism that became legendary. The guns finally fell silent at Gallipoli on December 20th, 1915. After 8 months of hell, the last Anzac soldiers slipped away from the peninsula under cover of darkness, leaving behind their dead and taking with them something that would prove more enduring than any military victory. They had failed to break through to Constantinople. They had failed to knock Turkey out of the war. But in failing, they had achieved something far more precious. They had forged a national identity in the crucible of shared sacrifice. From that narrow strip of Turkish coastline, From those blood-soaked gullies and shell-torn ridges emerged the spirit that would define Australia and New Zealand for generations to come. The beach massacre had indeed turned ordinary men into legends, and legends, unlike empires, never die.